and they can then say, this is because of our foreign enemy, and this is why we need your support, and we're doing it for the Palestinian cause. And in terms of having an effect on them, certainly there were no indications that they did last year. The bombing campaign that happened under the Biden and Rishi Sunak Prime Minister in Britain last year had any impact on them. There has been some indication with the more aggressive bombing campaign under President Trump that there has been some reduction in Houthi attacks on the USS Harry S. Truman and the US warships in the Red Sea, but they've still been attacking Israel. They've still been, firing missiles and got very close to hitting Ben Gurion Airport in the last few days, and managed to get through Israeli defense systems. So they haven't been degraded, I would say, and they haven't been deterred either. So, and most importantly, they hadn't actually carried out an attack against any merchant vessels in the Red Sea since last October. And the most recent one, and this is not on my data, this is the joint maritime data that's collected by the US and the UK and their reporting mechanism. The last one was against a US supply ship to the aircraft carrier in the Red Sea in November of last year. Yeah, they were still targeting US warships in the Red Sea after that, but commercial shipping, they hadn't carried out a successful attack since October 2024, and an attempted attack was in November. So, which really begs the question when we're talking about stopping the Houthis from attacking commercial shipping. They had already stopped, and that didn't mean they wouldn't start again. And certainly because it's connected to Gaza for them, there was this kind of de facto ceasefire in Yemen when the ceasefire in Gaza happened from the 19th of January. So there were no more strikes made by the Houthis into Israel. There were no more strikes against US vessels in the Red Sea, and there were no US or British airstrikes over that time. So what we know from that is if there was another ceasefire in Gaza, it would also stop the Houthis.
Stands to reason. You mentioned that it's an interesting conversation point to the governance during peacetime versus wartime. The classic tale as old as time. It's not my fault. Look at what everybody else is doing to us. They're to blame for. My children use it honestly quite often. Nothing is really their fault, and they can it's this finger machine gun that points at all the other things. And but you mentioned that they had their first. I don't want to say uprising against them, but demonstration against them, I believe was the term that you used. What's it like for Yemenis people living under Houthi rule? I mean, what does a day-to-day look like? Is it when they're at wartime? Is it a less antagonistic relationship? What got them to that point where they finally demonstrated against them?
It's become increasingly harsh to the point that now I can't even probably answer that question with much authenticity, because I don't connect directly with people in Houthi-controlled territory anymore because it's too much of a security risk for them.
Wow.
Because
even from an information email, phone call.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Because the Houthis last year, they carried out a sort of mass arrests and detentions of scores of Yemenis working for INGOs, doing any work on human rights, sort of data collection, all that kind of thing. And then another wave in January. And they've had this sort of year-long campaign now of going after what they're calling a sort of circle of Israeli and American spies. And this has been sort of part of a sort of growing feeling of living in a police state. And that has, even more recently, they carried out a social media campaign telling people to say, if anybody asks you about airstrikes, just say you don't know. And so even when I'm speaking to Yemeni friends in other parts of Yemen, trying to contact people in Houthi-controlled territory to find out how many civilians were killed in that strike, which you think the Houthis wouldn't be worried about people knowing about, they just say, I don't know. And there is no independent media. Trying to get anything independently verified now in Houthi territory is really hard. I mean, from the very beginning, even as foreign media, you weren't allowed to report from there without Houthi minders. I did it twice, but it got me into a serious amount of hot water. And it, on another level, I know I've got friends there who are living relatively normally. Although obviously the new sort of air campaign made them extremely nervous about what was going to happen next. And they're well aware of airstrikes going off around the city in Sana'a, for example. But Yemeni women are no longer allowed to travel without a male guardian, which never used to be the case when I was living in Yemen. I've met with female Yemeni friends who've come from Houthi-controlled territory since 2015, and they sort of said, yeah, they have to have a male guardian to be able to go anywhere now.